The town of Blackwood was a scar of rust-red brick and perpetual drizzle, tucked into the forgotten folds of the Pacific Northwest. I was Detective Marcus Thorne, 32, 3 years in Blackwood PD, and already feeling the damp rot seep into my bones. Blackwood wasn't a town for ambitious cops. It was a slow, dying organism where the biggest crime was usually petty theft or a missing cat. That changed on a Tuesday in late October. The call came in at 3:17 a.m. A 911 hang-up from an automated system pinging a derelict stretch of the old Redwood Highway, a road locals avoided even in daylight. Sergeant Elena Ellie Rossi and I took the cruiser out. The highway was a tunnel of ancient, moss-choked trees. It was so dark the high beams seemed to just absorb into the void. A hang-up from the abandoned Henderson place, Ellie muttered, checking the location on the tablet. Her voice was flat, tired. We'd been up since yesterday's shift. Seriously? That house has been empty for 20 years. It's probably a busted line or some kids messing around. I kept my eyes on the road, the silence between us heavy, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the wipers. The system flagged it as an Anomaly Code 4. That's new. Usually, it's just a standard 911 no response code. The Henderson House wasn't just abandoned, it was infamous. Back in the late 90s, the entire family, mother, father, 2 kids, vanished without a trace. No struggle, no forced entry, just a half-eaten dinner on the table and the front door slightly ajar. The original police report was 3 pages of baffling nothing. We pulled up to the property. The house was a black silhouette against the slightly less black sky, a sagging Gothic wreck swallowed by overgrown ivy and shadows. The only light was the harsh red and blue strobe of our cruiser. We approached the front door cautiously. It wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully closed. It hung open by an inch, like a patient's mouth slightly agape. Kids, definitely, Ellie whispered, drawing her sidearm. Let's clear the house. You take the left, I take the right. Stick to the radio. We stepped inside. The air was colder here than outside, and tasted of old dust, mildew, and something else, a faint, metallic scent that snagged at the back of my throat. The house was a tomb. The hook wasn't a scream, or a shadow, or a sudden noise. The hook was the silence, not the normal quiet of an empty house. This was a physical, dense lack of sound. It absorbed everything, our footsteps on the warped wooden floorboards, the rustle of our uniforms, even the low static hiss from our radios. It felt like walking through water, where every sound you made was immediately dampened, suffocated. The silence was absolute, a perfect vacuum. We moved through the ground floor, the untouched dining room, the kitchen with the perfectly preserved, rotten remnants of the final meal, the dimly lit parlor. Nothing. I reached the bottom of the main staircase. It was narrow, winding, and led up into the deeper dark. I raised my flashlight beam. That's when I saw it. On the 3rd step from the bottom, barely visible beneath a thick layer of dust, was a single, fresh, metallic red smear. Not blood, exactly. It was too vibrant, too glossy. But it was wet. Ellie, I whispered into the radio, my voice sounding flat and alien in the oppressive quiet. Found something on the stairs. Looks like fresh paint or something else. Heading up. No response. Ellie, respond. Do you read? Only the dead, empty static. Her frequency was completely silent. I checked my own radio. The power light was on, the volume up. The silence wasn't just inside the house. It had somehow swallowed our communication. I looked up the stairs, my hand gripping my gun, the metallic scent now stronger. The hook was set. I was utterly alone, standing on a staircase where fresh viscera-red liquid had been smeared onto a relic of a 20-year-old mystery, and the silence was so profound it had broken the rules of radio. I took the first step. Up, the warped wood groaning under my boot, a sound that died the second it was made. I moved up the staircase, each step a deliberate, agonizing decision. The flashlight beam cut a nervous cone through the blackness, revealing only more decay. The red smear on the third step was the only anomaly in the dust-caked inertia of the house. I touched it. The substance was thick, almost syrupy, with a scent that was definitely metallic, but underneath, something acrid, like burnt sugar. My boot hit the 10th step, and the floor above groaned in response, a deep, resonant sound that, again, was immediately clipped, swallowed by the dense silence. It was like walking in a soundproof chamber built in reverse. The silence didn't exclude noise. It consumed it. I reached the second-floor landing. The hallway was a mirror of the one below, a central corridor lined with 4 doors. The air here was dramatically colder, the metallic scent sharper. It was coming from the last door on the right. The master bedroom, probably. I stopped by the first door, pressing my back against the wall, trying to listen for anything, a whisper, a floorboard creak, a breath. Nothing. The silence was screaming. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of an omission. I tried the radio one last time. Ellie, I'm on the 2nd floor. Report status. Now. A dead channel. I holstered my gun and pulled out my personal cell phone, a futile gesture given Blackwood service black holes, but I needed to try. The screen lit up, no service. But there was a more unsettling detail, the clock. It read 03:22 a.m. 5 minutes. I had been inside for 5 minutes. I crept down the hall, passing the first 2 rooms, a dusty office, a small, empty bedroom. I came to the 3rd door. It was slightly ajar, just like the front door. This must have been the children's room. I nudged it open with my foot. The room was small, wallpaper peeling, and dominated by a pair of old twin beds. On the nightstand between them, there was something that made my stomach drop. 2 small, antique music boxes. And they were open. One of the music boxes was a ballerina, the other a circus clown. Both were wound tight, their tiny gears poised. But they weren't moving. They weren't playing. The mechanism was frozen, seemingly mid-note. It was as if the sound itself had been physically stopped, held captive. This wasn't kids playing a prank. This was fundamentally wrong. I backed out slowly, eyes fixed on the final door, the source of the metallic stench, and then I saw her. Sergeant Rossi was standing at the end of the hall, her back to me, facing the final door. Her silhouette was unnaturally rigid. Her service weapon was still holstered. Ellie. Jesus, you scared the hell out of me. Why didn't you answer the radio? I rushed toward her, relief flooding out the fear. She didn't move. She didn't turn. I stopped a few feet behind her. Ellie? I reached out to put a hand on her shoulder. Before I could make contact, I saw what she was staring at. The final door, the one that smelled of metal and burnt sugar, wasn't just closed. It was sealed. Not with a lock, but with something I couldn't comprehend. Across the wooden panels, forming a grotesque seal, was a layer of that same vivid, metallic red substance. It had been applied thick, smeared on like mortar, cementing the door shut. And then I finally looked at Ellie herself. The light from my flashlight fell across her hair, her neck, the back of her uniform. There were small, wet spots scattered across the fabric. They weren't red. They were translucent, like tiny, crystalline raindrops. I leaned in, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear my own heart now, loud and fast, but still, the general environment was silent, and then I saw the truth of the rain. Ellie's eyes were open, fixed on the red-sealed door. But the translucent spots weren't water. They were tears. Thick, silent, viscous tears that had tracked paths down her cheeks, pulling at her collarbone. She was silently, desperately weeping. But the most disturbing thing? The silence had consumed even this. Her chest wasn't moving. There was no hitching breath, no gasp, no shudder. Ellie Rossi was sobbing without a sound, without a single visible sign of muscular tension, trapped in a silent, suffocating loop of terror, staring at the door sealed with the metallic blood, and as I stood there, watching her silent, horrifying display of grief, the air around me began to vibrate, not with sound, but with an internal pressure. Something was trying to push its way through the silence. I had found my partner. But whatever had happened to the Henderson family 20 years ago, it hadn't left. It had learned how to use the quiet. And it had just claimed its second officer. I raised my gun, pointing it at the red-sealed door, knowing that whatever was behind it was what Ellie was silently begging me not to disturb. The pressure in my ears intensified. The pressure in my ears was a rising tide, a physical sensation divorced from sound. It wasn't pain yet, but a deep, uncomfortable fullness, like being trapped on a descending airplane. I stared at Ellie, whose silent tears continued to etch glistening paths down her face, and then at the sealed door. The metallic red substance wasn't just paint or blood. It was organic, almost alive, subtly shimmering under the beam of my flashlight. It looked like the membrane of a deep-sea creature. I took a shaky breath, aiming the muzzle of my gun, a standard-issue Glock 17, at the center of the sealed door. If this was a hostage situation, or some new breed of psychotic killer, the protocol was clear. But nothing about this felt like a man-made threat. The silence was the weapon. I needed to break the silence. I needed noise. I took a step back, raised my knee, and slammed my boot heel down onto the polished wood floor, putting all my weight into it. The sound was stillborn. The impact registered as a faint, muffled thud that died instantly, leaving behind only the aggressive silence. It was like striking sand. The internal pressure in my ears spiked. My head began to throb. I realized with terrifying clarity that the silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was an active, negative field. An anti-frequency that consumed vibrations and turned them into pressure. And Ellie was caught in the epicenter of its effect, unable to even vocalize her fear. I had to get her out. I lowered my weapon and grabbed Ellie's shoulder. Her body was rigid, cold, but she wasn't stiff. She felt like a statue carved from ice. I tried to pull her away from the wall. She didn't budge. Ellie, snap out of it. I kept my voice low, instinctively fearing what would happen if I yelled. We have to go. Come on. I put my arm around her waist and pulled hard. She remained rooted to the spot. Her eyes, wide and horrified, followed my every movement, but the muscles of her face were frozen in that silent expression of despair. Her gaze was locked on the red seal, a gaze that suggested she hadn't just seen something terrible, but had been forced to witness the process of its sealing. Suddenly, a flicker of movement. Not Ellie. Not the door. I glanced down at her utility belt. Hanging from it was her small, tactical knife, its metal handle vibrating so violently it was a blur. The pressure in the air was now so intense it was shaking the material objects that still had mass, yet it was producing no audible sound. Then, the static on her radio, which had been perfectly dead, flared to life with a single, excruciating shriek. A burst of pure, unfiltered white noise so loud and sharp that it cut through the anti-frequency for a split second, making me gasp. And in that split second of real sound, I heard something else. Something her silence had been hiding. A faint, dry, clicking noise, like a beetle trapped in a matchbox, emanating not from behind the sealed door, but from inside the wall next to Ellie. I instantly recoiled, yanking my hand away from her. The white noise died as quickly as it came, replaced by the crushing silence. The pressure returned, but the clicking noise had made its impression. Click, 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 click. The sound was too weak, too tiny, for the anti-frequency to completely consume, or maybe it was just on a frequency outside the field's focus. It was slow, rhythmic, and persistent, and as I watched the wall where the noise originated, I saw the plaster, covered in decades of grime, begin to spiderweb with thin, hairline cracks. The cracks spread outward from a point directly behind Ellie's head, forming a shape, the faint outline of a small, vertical rectangle. The music boxes downstairs. The Henderson children.my breath hitched. The fresh red seal on the master bedroom door had an answer to the 20-year-old missing persons case. But the clicking in the wall next to my partner suggested that whatever was left of the Henderson children wasn't behind the door. It was already inside the structure. And it was winding its way out. Click. Click, click. Faster now. I raised my gun again, pointing it at the cracking wall. Ellie's silent tears continued, her mouth slightly parting, finally allowing a tiny, silent exhale of air, the only physical evidence she was still alive. I shouted, throwing caution to the wind, aiming to shatter the oppressive silence. CPD, get away from her. My voice was a pathetic, muffled croak, a sound that barely traveled 2 feet before being absorbed, but the clicking stopped. And the cracking wall went silent. A moment of pure, frozen stillness. Then the small, rectangular outline in the plaster didn't crack further. It depressed. It sank inward like soft clay, forming a shallow recess, and then, from the black pit of that recess, a single, elongated index finger, bone white and thin as a twig, poked out. It curled slowly, making one final, wet click as it scraped against the remaining plaster. It was pointing directly at the brass nameplate pinned to Ellie's uniform, Rossi. The sight of that finger, brittle, unnaturally long, and undeniably skeletal, puncturing the plaster wall was the final, brutal severance from reality. This wasn't a crime scene anymore. It was an intersection with something terrible and hungry. The finger, bone white against the grimy wall, remained curled, pointing with unnerving precision at the nameplate on Ellie's chest. The air, already thick with the anti-frequency pressure, now carried a faint, dry smell, like ancient paper and pulverized chalk. I didn't hesitate this time. Training took over. I aimed and squeezed the trigger. The Glock bucked hard in my hand. In any normal environment, the shot would have been deafening, tearing the silence to shreds. Here, it was a sound that withered and died in flight. It was a vicious thump followed by a wet, chunky impact. The projectile hit the wall directly below the protruding finger. Plaster erupted in a cloud of fine, gray dust, but the skeletal digit remained intact, merely vibrating violently from the near-miss concussion. The anti-frequency field absorbed the bullet's report, but amplified the feeling of the discharge. The pressure in my skull exploded into blinding pain. It felt like my brain was trying to evacuate my ears. I lowered my weapon, gasping, my vision swimming. Ellie's silent, glassy tears continued, but now a fresh, chilling detail emerged. A thin trail of blood was beginning to seep from beneath her fingernails, where she was clenching her hands into fists. She wasn't just crying, she was suffering. The skeletal finger, momentarily still, began to retract slowly, pulling back into the dark recess. "No, you don't," I muttered, finding a sliver of clarity through the pain. I moved laterally, stepping past Ellie and pressing my back against the opposite wall. I kicked hard at the base of the crumbling plaster with my boot. The wall shuddered. The finger stopped retracting. I kicked again, closer to the rectangular depression. A larger chunk of plaster broke away, revealing the dark void behind. The clicking returned, but now it sounded different, more hurried, angrier. I peered into the hole. The flashlight beam cut into a narrow cavity, a space perhaps 4 inches deep between the structural studs. And it was crammed with something pale. It wasn't a finger. It was hundreds of them. The cavity was packed tight with what looked like small, skeletal appendages, tiny hands, elbows, and joints, all pressed together like nesting doll parts. They were dry, brittle, and articulated. It was the preserved, interred remains of the 2 Henderson children, somehow folded, compacted, and sealed within the thin space of the wall. And they were moving, They weren't propelled by air or collapsing structure. They were crawling, twisting, pressing against the inner surface of the plaster, trying to find another weak point. The clicking was the sound of bone scraping bone in the dry, chalky dust. I looked at Ellie. The moment the full horror of the wall's contents was revealed, her silent tears stopped. Her eyes, fixed on the red-sealed door, didn't move. But her mouth finally opened, just a fraction wider. I saw her throat bob, and a sound, the first true sound I had heard from her since entering the house, made it out. It was less a noise and more the internal vibration of a vocal cord, a dry, reedy rasp that the anti-frequency couldn't fully claim. It was a single word. A warning. Hush. But the word wasn't directed at me. It was aimed at the wall. As if obeying, the motion in the cavity slowed. The bone clicking subsided. The index finger that had pointed at her nameplate now lay still, curled against the edge of the hole. Ellie, what the hell is that? I demanded, lowering my voice again, terrified of invoking the anti-frequency's full power. We need to get out. What did you see? She shook her head, an infinitesimal movement, but her eyes held a new, chilling emotion. Pity. Pity for me. She then shifted her gaze, slowly, deliberately, from the sealed master bedroom door to the hole in the wall, to the silent, crawling death packed inside, and then I understood her single word of warning. It wasn't that the children in the wall were disturbed by noise. It was that they were listening for it. They were hunting sound. The Henderson family hadn't vanished. They had been silenced, compacted, and then, somehow, integrated into the very structure of the house, turning the house itself into a predatory sound trap. And then I heard a new, horrific noise. The subtle sizzle of wet paper being burned. It was coming from the red-sealed door. The organic membrane was not inert. It was reacting. I looked back at the door. Where the red substance met the wood, a section was peeling away, rolling inward like the skin of a terrible fruit, and from the gap, a high-pitched, almost imperceptible sound began to escape. It wasn't the clicking of bone. It was a low, undulating whine, the sound that the entire house had been trying to suppress. The sound of a tiny, forgotten music box, finally playing its tune. And the anti-frequency field was collapsing around it. The low, undulating whine intensified, a sickly sweet melody that sounded like a music box being played underwater. The anti-frequency, the suffocating silence that had dominated the house, was visibly fighting it, manifesting as violent spasms of air pressure. The internal throbbing in my head escalated to a screeching migraine. As the music box tune bled into the hall, the effect on Ellie was immediate and horrifying. Her body, previously rigid, began to twitch spasmodically. Her silent tears resumed, but now her neck strained backward, mouth wide in a silent, agonizing shriek. The blood seeping from her fingernails turned into a steady trickle. She wasn't just hearing the music. The music was unraveling her. I glanced wildly between the twitching, skeletal mass in the wall, which had resumed its slow, dry clicking, and the master bedroom door, where the red seal was tearing itself open to reveal the source of the sound. The door finally gave, swinging inward with a slow, heavy drag that exposed the room beyond. It was dark, but a single, focused light source provided illumination, a small, antique music box sitting on a dresser in the center of the room. It wasn't the clown or the ballerina from the children's room. This one was a complex, multi-layered mechanism, its gilded surface reflecting the eerie red remnants of the seal. It played the same unsettling, lilting waltz, but it wasn't the music box that held my focus. In the center of the room, standing completely still, was a figure. It was tall, gaunt, and wrapped in what looked like a tattered, mold-stained nightgown. Mrs. Henderson, perhaps. But the figure wasn't just standing. It was floating a few inches above the floor, swaying subtly to the rhythm of the music box. Its head was tilted back at an impossible angle, revealing a throat that was smooth, unnaturally elongated, and utterly featureless. No Adam's apple. No folds of skin, just a column of pale flesh. And where its mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, porcelain-like patch of skin. No lips. No teeth. No capacity for human speech or sound. This was the source of the 20-year-old silence. The true vacuum. The creature's arms, long and thin, were held out to its sides, palms up, perpetually open in a grotesque invitation. As the music box reached a discordant, high-pitched swell, the creature tilted its head toward me, its eyes too dark, bottomless pits, focusing instantly. The music was its voice. And its voice was reaching out. I raised my Glock again, aiming for center mass, but the sight of the porcelain-smooth face and the floating stance made me hesitate. What was center mass on a thing that defied gravity and seemed to be made of silence and malice? Ellie let out a tiny, choked gurgle, the sound of her last resistance. I looked over. She had stopped twitching. She was now perfectly still, her face pale white, fixed in an expression of blissful, terrible serenity. The blood continued to pour silently from her clenched fists. She was dead. But worse, she had been absorbed into the entity's anti-frequency, her agony replaced by its peaceful, empty stillness. The creature in the doorway gave no acknowledgement, its attention fixed solely on me. It began to drift, silently gliding out of the master bedroom and into the hallway. The music box inside continued its waltz, the sound now acting as a tether, pulling the creature toward me. I aimed lower at the creature's legs and fired twice. Thump thump. The bullets impacted the nightgown, tearing holes in the fabric, but there was no blood, no reaction. Just the sound of cotton ripping, which the anti-frequency instantly strangled. The creature didn't flinch. I backpedaled, retreating down the hallway toward the stairs. As I moved, the mass of skeletal parts in the wall next to Ellie erupted. The index finger tore free of the plaster, followed by dozens of tiny, clicking knuckles and wrists. They spilled out of the hole like white sand, instantly coalescing into two shapes at the base of the wall. Miniature, brittle human forms about 3 feet high. The children weren't behind the sealed door. They were its sentries. The two skeletal figures were dry, fragile, and fast. They scrambled onto the floor, their movements synchronized, and began to advance on me, their bone-on-wood clicking now loud enough to briefly penetrate the waltz. I was trapped. The silent, gliding creature with the porcelain face and the fatal music box tune in front of me, and the twin, clicking remnants of the Henderson children behind me. I reached the top of the stairs, turned, and fired a desperate shot into the floor near the descending figures. I needed an exit, a distraction, anything to disrupt the harmony of this silent horror. The shot did nothing to the creatures, but it cracked a load-bearing joist. I planted my foot on the landing and hurled my empty Glock 17, the metal itself now too hot to hold from the constant anti-frequency pressure, down the stairwell. The gun hit the bottom, landing with a heavy, sharp clang. The sound, for a brief, glorious second, was too much for the dying anti-frequency to handle. It broke the spell. The music box skipped, stuttered, and the creature in the hallway paused its gliding motion, its featureless face twisting in what I perceived as momentary pain or confusion. The distraction was minimal, but it was enough. I vaulted over the rickety banister, choosing the 12-foot drop onto the first floor, landing over the silent, weeping death waiting for me in the hallway. I hit the floor hard, the air knocked out of my lungs, but alive, above me, the creature recovered quickly. I could hear the high, sick note of the music box resuming its waltz, now joined by the furious, rapid-fire rat-a-tat-tat of 2 sets of skeletal feet chasing me down the stairs. I scrambled up, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle, and ran for the front door, leaving the silence, the terror, and the memory of Ellie's weeping face behind me. I burst out onto the porch, gasping for the cold, clean October air. I made it 5 feet from the porch before I heard the final, chilling sound of the night. It wasn't a click. It wasn't the music. It was the heavy, iron latch of the front door, slamming shut behind me. Not just closed, locked, and from inside the sealed house, I heard a high, clear, little girl voice, whispering, not demanding, but simply stating a horrifying truth that transcended the silence. You forgot your radio. My police cruiser was still running, its lights flashing, the radio console glowing. My radio mic, the one I had left on the passenger seat, was silent, but the house was now talking. And I was locked outside, tethered to its horror. I spun around, my back hitting the massive, ivy-choked oak tree near the driveway. The old Henderson house stood against the pre-dawn gloom, its windows like black, hollowed-out eyes. The heavy clunk of the iron latch was the loudest sound I'd heard all night, a definitive, echoing finality that mocked the anti-frequency's previous dominion. My breath plumed in the cold air. The relief of escaping the interior was instantly replaced by the sickening realization that I was now trapped outside the trap. The cruiser sat 20 yards away, a beacon of failed rescue, and then the radio. The whispering voice, a child's voice, dry and saccharine, had mentioned my radio. I looked towards the cruiser. The passenger side window was half down, exactly where Ellie had left it. The police band radio console was softly illuminated. I started running towards the cruiser, limping on my throbbing ankle. The whispering started again, not from the house, but from the cruiser's external speakers, which must have been left on the open channel. Detective Thorne. The voice sighed, breathy and close, as if the speaker were right next to my ear. Such a lonely tune. Why did you stop playing with us? The voice wasn't speaking through the radio. It was coming from the radio. The frequency was dead, just the high, empty static of an open channel. But the voice was clear, intimate, and impossibly present. I reached the cruiser, wrenching open the driver's side door. The interior light flared on. I grabbed my spare sidearm from the glove compartment and then slammed my hand down on the radio's volume knob, twisting it counterclockwise. The whispering didn't stop. It actually grew louder, as if the volume control had ceased to affect the signal and was now merely governing the ambient static. We missed the music box, Marcus, the voice chirped, sounding amused. But your silence is even louder. We can feel you shivering. It knew my name. It was using the very technology of communication to taunt me, overriding the signal, turning the cruiser into a whispering station. I fumbled for the ignition, keying the engine to life. I needed to get out of the radius of this thing, this sentient silence field. The engine roared to life, a blessed, tangible noise. I slammed the transmission into reverse, flooring the gas. The tires spat gravel as the cruiser fishtailed. Turning toward the old redwood highway. As I sped backward, my headlights momentarily flashed across the front porch of the Henderson house. The front door was still sealed shut, but standing on the porch, leaning casually against the railing, was the tall, pale figure from the master bedroom. It was no longer floating. It was grounded, watching me with those dead, black eyes, and beside it, perched on the railing, were the two skeletal constructs, the children. They weren't clicking. They were still. As the cruiser straightened and I started speeding forward down the dark highway, the child's voice in the radio, now loud and dominant, delivered the final, devastating blow of the moment. Your friend is still here, Marcus. We liked her song the best. And then, the sound changed. The whispering stopped. In its place, the cruiser's speakers began to emit a high-pitched, reedy sound, like a broken cassette tape, a sound I instantly recognized. A sound that sliced through the panic and went straight to the bone. It was Ellie Rossi's scream. It wasn't a live scream. It was a digital loop, compressed, distorted, and played back at maximum volume. It was the sound that the anti-frequency had swallowed whole, the sound she had been silently struggling to release. The house had captured it, digitized it, and was now broadcasting it as a testament to its power. I drove blindly, Ellies digitized, endless terror screaming in the cabin with me. The sound was so intense, so physically agonizing, that I felt ball rise in my throat. I couldn't turn it off. I couldn't escape it. The entity had tethered itself to the only functional piece of technology one had. I reached the point where the Redwood Highway rejoined the main road, braking hard enough to throw myself against the seatbelt. I stopped the car, engine running, and reached for the radio, intending to tear the wires out, but as my hand touched the console, the screaming abruptly cut off. The speakers clicked once, then switched to the familiar, low static hum of a normal, open channel. And then, a new voice, a human voice, thick with sleepy static and the boredom of a long night shift, came through the speakers. It was Dispatcher Carl Jenkins, back at Blackwood PD. 18, David, you copy? I got your 911 call back, Marcus. Everything all right out there? Seems like you're off channel. What's your status? My own radio, the same one that had been screaming Ellie's final moments, was now functioning perfectly, communicating with the outside world as if nothing had happened. The silence had retreated. The game was over. For now, I looked in the rearview mirror, but the darkness had swallowed the old Henderson house. I was alone on the highway, my ankle on fire, my heart hammering, and the ghost of Ellie's scream ringing in my ears. I took a deep, shuddering breath, my hand still resting on the console that was no longer a torture device, but a lifeline. Dispatch, this is 18 David, I managed, my voice raw and trembling. I have a situation. Officer down. Code 6. I need backup, full hazmat, and a perimeter established around the Henderson property. And Carl. I paused, looking at the silent passenger seat where Ellie's ghost still seemed to sit. Send a trauma team. And tell the chief to prepare the department for a mass casualty investigation. Tell them we found Whispering Station. The next few hours would be about filing a report no one would believe, and containing a supernatural horror that no amount of police tape could hold. But first, I had to drive back. I had to face the quiet house again, knowing that the ghost in the machine was still listening. And it knew my name. The return trip was the longest 5 minutes of my life. I drove slowly, headlights cutting through the early morning mist. When I pulled up to the Henderson property, the cruiser was silent, the main channel humming innocuously. The old house stood precisely as I had left it, dark, silent, and overwhelmingly malevolent. Two things struck me immediately. The front door was once again slightly ajar, just as we had found it initially, and there were no flashing police lights. The rhythmic red and blue strobes of our cruiser, which had been active when I fled, were now entirely off. The car was running, the engine idling, but the external lights were dead. It was another unsettling instance of the house's power over electrical systems, a subtle erasure of evidence. I grabbed the patrol shotgun from the rack, chambered a round, and stepped out, the damp air hitting my face. I had called in the nightmare. Now I had to wait for the cavalry. 5 minutes later, the main road filled with the rising whine of sirens. A 4-car convoy, Chief Miller's unmarked sedan, 2 patrol units, and an ambulance, screeched to a halt 20 yards behind me. Chief Miller, a man whose patience was as thin as his graying hair, strode up to me, his face a mask of weary anger. He saw my bloodied hands, from gripping the Glock and my hard landing, my limping gait, and the wide, panicked look in my eyes. Thorne, what the hell is Code 6? And why did you call in a mass casualty? He demanded, keeping his voice low but razor sharp. Where's Rossi? Her cruiser is still here. I tried to tell him. I started with the 911 hang-up, the Anomaly Code 4, the silence, the stairs, and the red smear. But the story felt ridiculous, collapsing under the weight of its own impossibility. The silence wasn't empty, Chief, it was active. It broke the radio. Ellie was standing there, weeping silently, staring at the master bedroom door, which was sealed with some kind of red, organic material. She was rooted to the spot. I think she... I trailed off, the word dead catching in my throat. Miller's eyes narrowed. Slow down, detective. You lost your partner, and you're talking about active silence and organic seals. Did you engage? Did you see the perp? I pointed a shaking hand at the house. I saw two things, Chief. A tall, pale figure inside the master bedroom, no mouth, floating, and the remains of the Henderson children in the wall. They were clicking. They were moving. A patrolman, Officer Davis, coughed nervously behind the chief. Chief Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. Thorne, listen to me. You're in shock. You've had a traumatic incident. Let's find Rossi. Davis, you and Johnson check the cruiser and secure the perimeter. Everyone else, weapons drawn. We're clearing the house. He didn't believe a word of the supernatural report, but he saw the urgency and the missing officer. That was enough. The search team, 3 patrolmen, the chief, and myself advanced towards the open door. Just as we reached the porch, the ambulance siren, which had been turned off, suddenly erupted. The sound wasn't the steady whoop of a normal siren. It was a cacophony of sound, rapid, distorted bursts, intercut with static, electronic screeching, and then, distinctly, the single, reedy note of the music box. The noise was maddening, utterly devoid of rhythm or pattern, aimed squarely at disrupting human thought. The patrolmen flinched, covering their ears. Get that turned off. Miller roared at the ambulance driver, who was frantically fumbling with the controls. The noise stopped as quickly as it started. Silence rushed back, not the anti-frequency, but normal, heavy, empty silence. It was a warning. A demonstration. The house was listening, and it was playing with our attention. Thorne, you said the radio. Miller looked at me, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. It knows how to use our electronics, Chief, I whispered. It uses sound as a weapon. We entered the house. With 5 men and 5 flashlights, the interior seemed slightly less terrifying, though the oppressive cold remained. The metallic burnt sugar smell was still present. I led them directly up the stairs. The red smear on the 3rd step was gone. Wiped clean. The dust was pristine. Nothing here, Detective, Miller stated flatly, shining his light on the stair. We reached the 2nd floor landing. The light from the team's flashlights swept the hallway, and there she was, Sergeant Elena Rossi. She was slumped against the wall, perfectly positioned where I had last seen her, but she wasn't frozen and weeping. She was facing the sealed master bedroom door, her back to us. Her body was intact. No blood. No visible wounds. Chief Miller rushed forward. Ellie, are you all right? He reached out to touch her. As he did, Rossi's head turned slowly, mechanically, toward the chief. Her eyes were wide and fixed. Her face was calm, pale, and completely dry. The tears, the silent sobbing, the terror all gone. I'm fine, Chief, she said, her voice flat, emotionless, but perfectly audible. I just got disoriented. I think the static hit the wrong frequency and made me lightheaded. The relief that washed over the chief was visible, overwhelming the earlier frustration. Thank God. Thorne said, well, Thorne said a lot of things. Let's get you out of here, Sergeant. But my blood ran cold. The Ellie I saw was wrong. Too calm. Too clean. I scanned the walls. The hole. The rectangular depression where the skeletal figures had escaped. The wall was perfectly intact. Smooth plaster, covered in decades of uniform, undisturbed dust. There was no crack, no depression, no sign of the white horror I had witnessed. It was as if my entire terrifying encounter, the clicking, the silent tears, the red seal, had been surgically excised from reality. I took a step back, raising my shotgun, aiming it at my own partner. "Don't touch her, Chief," I barked. "That's not Ellie. She was crying, Chief. She was bleeding from her fists. And the wall was broken." Ellie turned her blank, pale face towards me. A small, serene smile touched the edges of her lips. "Marcus," she said, her voice still unnaturally flat. "You shouldn't have come back. The house doesn't like noisy things." And as she spoke, the silence in the hallway deepened, becoming the familiar, oppressive, painful anti-frequency again. And from the closed master bedroom door behind her, the sickeningly sweet waltz of the music box began to play. The house was resetting the stage, and this time, it had an accomplice. The familiar, crushing pressure of the anti-frequency returned instantly, slamming into my eardrums. The air grew frigid. The music box waltz, sickly sweet and hypnotic, filled the silence that swallowed every other vibration. Chief Miller and the two patrolmen froze, caught between the unsettling calmness of Ellie and my shotgun aimed directly at her. "Thorne, put the gun down." "That's an order," Miller yelled, his voice sounding strangely muffled, already battling the growing field. "Look at her, Chief," I shouted back, fighting the urge to clutch my throbbing head. "She's not breathing. She's staged. Where's the red seal? Where's the hole in the wall?" It erased the crime scene. Miller glanced frantically at the wall, which was indeed perfectly intact, then back at Rossi. She appeared fine, albeit pale. But I knew the truth. The creature had claimed her and was using her as a shell, a perfect psychological weapon. "Ellie, speak to him," Miller urged, reaching a tentative hand toward her arm. Ellie didn't speak. She just kept that faint, serene smile fixed on her face, the smile of someone who has achieved permanent peace through total silence. As Miller's hand brushed her uniform sleeve, the subtle motion triggered a reaction. Ellie's arm shot out with unnatural speed, not to strike, but to grab the chief's wrist. Her grip was iron, instantly pinning his arm against the wall. Miller gasped, his eyes widening in pain and shock. "Rossi, what the Ellie hissed, but the sound was thin and dry, lacking the warmth of human breath. It was the sound of air escaping a cracked porcelain shell. The two patrolmen, Davis and Johnson, finally reacted, bringing their weapons up. "Let him go, Rossi," Davis yelled. Ellie ignored him. Her other hand, which had been concealed behind her back, slowly lifted. In her grasp, she held the object of my escape, my police radio, the one the whispering voice had mentioned. It wasn't just a radio now. It was covered in a thin, glistening veneer of that same metallic red substance I had seen on the stairs and the door. It was pulsing faintly, like a captured heart. "You left a noisy toy behind, Marcus," she droned, her voice flat and perfectly synthesized. "And then you brought more noisy friends." With a swift, smooth motion, Ellie wrenched the chief's wrist, snapping the bone with a sickening, wet crack that the anti-frequency failed to entirely suppress. Miller cried out a sharp, strangled sound of pure agony. Then, she jammed the exposed antenna of the pulsing, red-coated radio directly into the chief's eye socket. The chief didn't even have time to scream. The metallic red substance on the radio immediately flowed, dissolving the patrol cap and melding the electronic device with the bone and flesh of his head. It turned his skull into an antenna. The music box waltz stopped. The oppressive silence shattered, replaced by an excruciating, electronic screech of feedback that ripped through the hallway. It wasn't just loud, it was precisely engineered, a deafening tone aimed at liquefying the brain. Davis and Johnson collapsed immediately, clutching their heads, their screams absorbed by the sheer intensity of the audio assault. I had instinctively dropped my shotgun and covered my ears, but the sound vibrated through my bones, paralyzing me. This was the entity's full power, the complete control over sound, converting a silent field into a weapon of mass auditory destruction. Ellie stood amidst the carnage, her face still serene, the radio antenna fusion in Miller's skull now glowing with a soft, pulsing red light. She wasn't human anymore. She was a conduit. She looked at me, her mouth parting slightly in that unsettling, quiet smile. "We have to make sure the station hears everything, Marcus." I saw my chance. The sound was too chaotic, too powerful for the entity to maintain the anti-frequency field locally. The pressure was gone, replaced by noise. I lunged forward, not toward Ellie, but toward the master bedroom door behind her. I kicked the door hard, aiming for the hinges. The wood buckled, weakened by the previous seal and the sheer sound waves. I shoved past Ellie and dove into the master bedroom, hearing the rapid, dry skittering of the skeletal figures emerging from the walls again, drawn by the new chaos. The room was dominated by the small, multi-layered music box on the dresser, its winding key still spinning from the last melody. I didn't see the pale, floating woman. She must have retreated back into the silence when the noise began. I scrambled to my feet, my head swimming. I saw a small, antique iron poker lying by the fireplace. I grabbed it just as Ellie, abandoning her role, lunged through the doorway. She moved with impossible speed, her arms reaching for my throat. I swung the poker like a baseball bat, aiming for her head. The iron met the porcelain-smooth skin of her face with a heavy, sickening thunk. Instead of bone shattering, the skin rippled, like hitting thick, viscous water. The serenity on her face cracked, replaced by an instant, raw flash of pure, alien fury. The feedback in the hallway reached an unbearable pitch. Ellie reeled back, staggering. I had hit a shell, but I had hurt the occupant. I knew the weapon wasn't the poker, the gun, or the light. It was the sound. My eyes fixed on the small, spinning key of the music box. It was the heart of the anti-frequency. I ignored Ellie and rushed the dresser. I brought the iron poker down on the music box with all my remaining strength. The intricate wood and metal shattered in a single, catastrophic blow. The tiny gears, the coiled springs, and the delicate cylinder were smashed into dust. The moment the music box was destroyed, the electronic feedback in the hallway died. The terrible noise vanished. The silence that returned was normal. Cold, empty, quiet, the silence of an old, abandoned house. The anti-frequency was gone. Ellie stood paralyzed in the doorway, staring at the debris on the dresser. The serene smile had fallen away entirely, leaving her face a vacant, slack mask of pale flesh. The red glow on the chief's head vanished. The house had lost its voice. I turned the poker on the wall, smashing a section of the plaster until I found the studs. I needed fire. I needed to destroy the core. From the hallway, I heard the ragged, choking cough of Officer Davis. The surviving patrolmen were stirring. They were hurt, but alive. I looked at Ellie. Her body suddenly seemed to deflate, losing that uncanny rigidity. She crumbled to the floor, landing with a heavy, unceremonious thud, the sound of a dead weight hitting wood. She was just the shell again. The host had fled, retreating back into the structure. I looked down at the wreckage of the music box, then at the smoking poker in my hand. I had won the battle for noise, but the war for the house was far from over. I had to burn it all down. And I still had 8 parts of the story to get through. I ran out of the master bedroom, grabbing the conscious patrolman, Davis. "Help me get them out," I yelled, pointing to Johnson and the grievously injured Chief Miller. "Now, before the house finds a new song." The silence was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. The blissful, clean quiet of the ordinary. It meant the creature was defeated, or worse, regrouping, searching for a new frequency. Officer Davis, pale and bleeding from his ears, scrambled to his feet. Officer Johnson was stirring, moaning faintly. Chief Miller lay still, the red-crusted radio still fused to his eye socket, a grim, silent monument to the power of the anti-frequency. Johnson, get on the radio. Call for immediate support and EMTs. Tell them to stay outside the perimeter. I yelled, my voice still hoarse from the auditory assault. I kicked the Ellie husk lying on the floor. It didn't move. She was dead, but the entity had vacated the premises. Davis, shaking violently, grabbed Johnson and dragged him toward the stairs. The chief, he whispered, staring at Miller's shattered wrist and fused radio. Leave him. We need to destroy this house now. We stopped the sound. We stopped the thing. I rushed back into the master bedroom, grabbing the smashed music box parts, looking for anything that could be fuel. The ancient dresser. The heavy curtains. I jammed the iron poker into the wall again, desperately looking for the structural core, the center of the terror. Behind the plaster, I found not just wood, but a strange, damp, fibrous material. It was black and spongy, smelling faintly of the same burnt sugar and metallic blood. It was the mycelium of the house. The organic network that housed the skeletal figures and propagated the anti-frequency. I lit my utility lighter, igniting the tattered velvet curtains. They caught quickly, the dry fabric turning instantly to flame. We have to burn it. Get out. I roared. Davis, supporting Johnson, was already halfway down the stairs. The fire was growing, the flames casting dancing, terrifying shadows against the opposite wall. As the first tendrils of smoke filled the hallway, a sound returned. Not the waltz, not the whispering, but a high-pitched, angry squealing, like thousands of dry fingernails dragging across a blackboard. It was coming from the floorboards, the walls, everywhere at once. The heat was forcing the contents of the house to flee. I looked at the skeletal husk of Ellie one last time. She deserved a better ending. I placed the still-smoking iron poker next to her and turned, running toward the growing inferno at the staircase. I heard the dry clicking resume, louder than ever. The skeletal children were emerging from the walls again, not just from the hole I'd seen, but from dozens of new cracks forming in the heat. They were small, rapid, and they were trying to climb the rising smoke. I scrambled down the stairs, jumping the final steps. The air was thick with smoke and that terrible, screeching squeal. I reached the front door and threw my shoulder into it. It was still ajar. I burst onto the porch, collapsing onto the dew-soaked ground, gasping for air. Davis and Johnson were already at the cruiser, dragging the chief's inert body towards the ambulance crew that had stayed at the perimeter. I looked back. The fire was spreading rapidly up the second floor. Black smoke billowed from the windows, and the ancient wood was cracking under the heat. The squealing was almost deafening now, radiating from the structure itself. It sounded like the house was tearing itself apart, the silent monster finally forced to voice its agony. Suddenly, a massive, explosive crack echoed through the woods. A huge chunk of the roof structure collapsed, sending a shower of burning debris into the night sky. The fire engulfed the master bedroom entirely, and when the structure collapsed, the squealing stopped. Abruptly. Completely. A silence fell over the property, a deep, pervasive quiet that felt heavy with exhaustion. I stood there, watching the Henderson House burn, the flames painting the faces of the arriving EMTs and patrolmen in shades of desperate orange. We had won. We had found the monster, and we had incinerated its sanctuary. Time jump. 48 hours later, I sat in Chief Miller's temporary office at the Blackwood PD station. My ankle was strapped, my head throbbed, and I was on my third cup of coffee. Outside, the world was normal. Cars drove by, phones rang, cops processed paperwork. Sound was abundant, noisy, and safe. The official report was filed under structural fire, cause undetermined, possible electrical fault. Ellie Rossi's death was ruled accidental, resulting from a fall and massive head trauma while disoriented during the fire. Chief Miller was in critical condition, the radio surgically removed, His long-term prognosis uncertain. No one believed the part about the skeletal children, the floating porcelain woman, or the sentient silence. They were filing my report under psychological trauma and auditory hallucination. I was alive. That was the only thing that mattered to the department. I was running my hand over the burn marks on my shotgun, cleaning the grime from the house off the stock. A young officer, a fresh face named Peterson, knocked on the open door. "Detective Thorne," he asked nervously. "I have something for you." From the Henderson site. He held out a plastic evidence bag. Inside, nestled among soot and ash, was a single, small, charred item. A piece of metal, no bigger than a quarter, partially melted, but recognizable. It was the winding key from the master bedroom music box. "They found it in the debris near where the main floor joists collapsed," Peterson explained. "It's completely melted, but it didn't seem to oxidize like the other metals." I took the bag, the metal feeling cold through the plastic. "Thank you, officer. Head home, get some sleep." Peterson left, and I was alone again. I held the melted key up to the light. The creature's heart, destroyed. We found Whispering Station. I placed the evidence bag on the desk. I was about to reach for my coffee when my personal cell phone, the one that had displayed no service in the house, began to ring. It wasn't a normal ring. It was a high-pitched, metallic trill that had no known setting on my phone. I stared at the caller ID. It was completely blank. I answered it. "Hello." My voice was cautious, tired. A long, static-filled silence. Then a dry, reedy child's voice, the same one from the cruiser, spoke. It wasn't whispering now. It was a clear, synthesized tone. "Marcus, the music box is broken." But the song, the line cut out, replaced by a deep, constant dial tone. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the melted key on the desk, then at the silent phone. The creature hadn't needed the house. It hadn't needed the physical sound trap. It had simply hitched a ride on the one thing that connects the modern world. The creature wasn't the house. It was the signal. And it was calling from somewhere else. I had destroyed the station. But the whisper had just found a new, global frequency. I slammed the phone down onto the desk, the cheap plastic casing rattling. The dial tone persisted for a few agonizing seconds before cutting out, leaving the office in a ringing silence that felt strangely familiar. I grabbed the melted music box key, my knuckles white. The creature was still active. It had used the chaos of the fire, the sudden burst of immense energy and sound, to shunt its presence, its core frequency, onto the cellular network. It had traded an isolated, localized trap for a global, ubiquitous one. If the creature was the signal, and the signal was everywhere, then Whispering Station wasn't a place anymore. It was the entire world's communication infrastructure. I stared at my phone, now inert and innocent-looking. I needed to understand how it made the call. The number was blank, the trill unique. It was a perfect, malicious hack. I threw the phone into the desk drawer, locking it shut. My first, desperate action, cut the tether, but then I remembered Carl Jenkins, the dispatcher, and the two patrolmen, Davis and Johnson, who had been subjected to the creature's full auditory assault. I needed to know if the creature had planted seeds in anyone else. I sprinted down the hall to the communications room. The room was loud, filled with the comforting, banal chatter of police dispatch. Carl Jenkins was sitting at his console, looking tired but normal, chewing gum as he coordinated a traffic accident. "Carl, stop everything," I ordered, my voice loud and harsh. "Listen to me closely. Do you remember the moment my radio came back online at the Henderson property?" Carl pulled his headset down to his neck, giving me a bored, puzzled look. "Yeah, 18, David. You were off-channel for a good 10 minutes. I got the automated callback, but you didn't answer until later." "Why? What did you hear right before I answered? What was on the main channel?" Carl shrugged, popping his gum. "Static. Just the usual empty static, Thorne. Nothing else. Why are you sweating so much? He heard nothing. He hadn't heard Ellie's screaming loop. He hadn't heard the child's whispering. The creature hadn't used the main frequency. It had created a private, localized channel between its current physical hub, the house/cruiser, and the immediate target, me. Carl was too far away, too focused on the noise of his job to tune into the subtle, supernatural override. A flicker of hope ignited. The creature needed proximity and focus. Carl, I need a list of every single electronic device recovered from the Henderson property. Radios, watches, personal phones, everything. And pull all logs from the ambulance that treated Miller and the others. Anything that was communicating wirelessly. I turned, heading toward the parking lot to check on Davis and Johnson, when my eyes fell on the bulletin board. A large, laminated notice detailing the upcoming annual Blackwood Police Department charity telethon. A 24-hour broadcast live on multiple local radio and TV stations. An enormous, concentrated source of sound and signal. My blood ran cold. The creature needed a new music box. And the telethon was a massive, centralized, irresistible target. I found Officer Davis in the squad room, meticulously cleaning his patrol rifle. He looked jumpy, his hands slightly trembling, but physically recovering. "Davis, how's your hearing?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Ringing on and off, Detective. The doc says it's temporary trauma." "I'll be fine." "The chief, what was his status when you moved him?" Davis paused, his eyes glazing over, the memory clearly painful. He was unresponsive. The ambulance crew said they couldn't risk removing the device yet. They had to stabilize him. "Did you hear anything strange on your personal phone or radio on the way back? Any weird static or voices?" Davis shook his head, looking irritated. "No, Thorne. Look, I know you went through something crazy, but the chief is critical Ellie's dead. I just want to finish my shift and forget that place." He was clean. The trauma had been auditory, but it hadn't seeded. I was about to leave when I noticed a detail. Davis was wearing a new watch, a heavy, black tactical digital model. His old, standard-issue watch was gone. "Where's your old watch, Davis?" "Oh, the analog one? It stopped working at the house. Just flatlined when that noise started. I left it on the seat of the patrol car. Figured it was useless." I suppressed a gasp. The anti-frequency field destroyed anything that kept a rhythm, a small sound. The old music boxes. The old watch. But the new one, digital, silent, was fine. The entity had an aversion to rhythm, to predictable sound, preferring noise and chaos. I rushed out, grabbing the keys to Davis's patrol car. Inside the locked vehicle, on the passenger seat, I found the discarded analog watch. The hands were frozen at 3:22 a.m., the exact moment the anti-frequency had fully engaged in the house, but there was something else. Next to the watch lay Davis's personal cell phone. I didn't open it. I knew I wouldn't find any visible red goo or strange marks. It would look normal, but I picked it up. It felt slightly warm in my hand. I held it to my ear, and from the silent speaker, I heard it. Not a voice, but a tiny, faint, repetitive noise. Click. Click, click. Click, the dry, chalky clicking of the skeletal figures. It was coming from inside the phone's circuitry, embedded in the standby mode, waiting for an opportunity. The creature had planted a small, silent sentinel in Davis's phone, waiting for the right moment to awaken and turn the device into a new whispering station. The global frequency had a listening post. I dropped the phone into a bucket of water and short-circuited it instantly. The clicking stopped, one down. But how many more signals were out there? The ambulances, the medical equipment, the communications gear that had been within the perimeter. And the telethon. The creature hadn't just survived. It had adapted, and it was preparing to broadcast its sound of silence to the entire world. I had to stop the telethon. I checked my own phone drawer one last time. The discarded, Waterlogged handset was gone. I didn't panic. The drawer was locked. The phone couldn't have moved. I looked down. On the floor, leading out of the office, was a thin, dry trail of fine, gray dust, the same chalky substance I'd seen surrounding the compact remains in the wall. The sentinel had already escaped, and it had taken my phone with it. I was in a race against a sound that traveled at the speed of light. The chalky trail of dust was nearly invisible against the gray linoleum of the police station floor, but to me, it was a neon sign. The sentinel, the small, skeletal piece of the Henderson horror, had escaped my custody and taken my communication device with it. I grabbed the melting music box key and my shotgun. I had to assume the creature's immediate target was the Blackwood telethon, the largest concentration of controlled, repetitive sound in the county, scheduled to start in 4 hours. The broadcast was being staged in the downtown Blackwood Community Auditorium. I burst into the chief's temporary office, ignoring the startled look of the duty sergeant. The telethon, I graded out, pointing at the bulletin board. We need to shut it down. Immediately. It's a risk. Auditory threat. The sergeant stared at me, then at the shotgun in my hand. Detective Thorne, that's Chief Miller's pet project. It's a major event. We can't just cancel on your say-so. It's not my say-so, I corrected, pointing to the spot where my phone had been. It's the creature's say-so. It's going to use the broadcast to spread its signal. Call the mayor. Call the station manager. Shut down the broadcast now. The sergeant, seeing the sheer, desperate conviction in my eyes, reluctantly picked up the phone. I didn't wait. I took a marked patrol car and drove straight to the Blackwood Community Auditorium. The auditorium was a hive of frantic, last-minute activity. Crew members were checking microphone levels, volunteers were setting up donation lines, and the local news anchor, a chipper woman named Brenda, was doing a final sound check. The air was thick with loud, vibrant, perfectly controlled noise. The antithesis of the Henderson House. I strode past the security desk, flashing my badge, and pushed my way into the main control booth overlooking the auditorium floor. Stop the broadcast, I yelled, startling the sound engineer, a young man with large headphones named Tim. Kill the mics. Shut down the main transmitter. Tim yanked off his headphones, bewildered. Whoa, who are you? We're live in 10 minutes. We have Mayor Thompson on speed dial. I'm Detective Thorne. I'm giving you a direct emergency order. If you transmit anything, this building and everyone connected to the signal will be compromised. Before Tim could fully process the threat, the large monitor above the main stage, which was displaying the telethon countdown, flickered violently. The digital timer didn't stop. It began to accelerate, the numbers blurring, running backward at an impossible speed. 9 minutes and 58 seconds. 1 second. 00:00:00. The countdown hit 0 instantly. The broadcast was live, but the screens didn't display the cheerful image of anchor Brenda. They displayed a pattern of visual feedback, sharp, erratic static lines in vibrant white and red, and the only sound that filled the massive auditorium was the familiar, high-pitched, electronic screech of audio feedback. The same brain-liquefying tone that had floored the patrolman and shattered Chief Miller. The creature had hijacked the main audio feed. It had used the power of the broadcast signal to instantly overcome all physical safety barriers. The Blackwood Telethon was now the new, infinitely more powerful whispering station. People in the auditorium, volunteers, crew, the camera operators fell to the floor, clutching their heads. Screaming silently as the feedback saturated the air. I threw my hands over my ears, fighting the paralysis. The intensity was magnified 1,000 times by the massive PA system. The transmitter. Kill the transmitter. I managed to scream at Tim, pointing to the rack of equipment. Tim, doubled over in pain, could only shake his head, pointing a trembling finger at the main transmitter unit. I looked at the unit. It wasn't just working. It was weeping. Thin, silvery tears were seeping from the vents and display screen of the massive metal box. And covering the entire unit, pulsing with the same red light, was a thin, oily coating of that familiar, metallic red substance. It had sealed. The controls. The entity was physically fusing itself with the broadcast infrastructure. It had found its new body. As I watched, the high-pitched feedback began to modulate. It lowered, shifted, and focused, turning into a rhythmic, electronic pulse. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The pulse began to sync with the digital static on the screens, creating a pattern that was visually and audibly excruciating. The creature was not broadcasting silence or noise. It was broadcasting a hostile frequency. Suddenly, the pulsing stopped. The screens went black. The sound died. Silence. A perfect, echoing silence that felt colder and deeper than any I had ever experienced. The global anti-frequency had been activated, using the entire bandwidth of the Blackwood telethon to create a massive, localized vacuum. I looked out over the auditorium. Hundreds of people were frozen, bodies contorted, eyes wide and glazed over a sea of silent agony, a perfect harvest of paralysis, just like Ellie Rossi. Then, from the speakers, a single, clear, ringing tone emerged. A note so pure it sounded like crystal glass shattering in slow motion, and over the note, the child's voice returned, but this time, it was being broadcast with crystal clarity, speaking to everyone, everywhere the telethon signal reached. "We like this house, Marcus. It has so many years." I looked down at the floor and saw it, a tiny trail of chalky dust snaking from the floor vent near the main console, leading into the wall behind the stage. The small, skeletal sentinel. It had found the main artery. I had failed to stop the signal. The creature was now fully broadcast. It was infecting every device, every speaker, every electronic receiver in the town. I grabbed the melted music box key, the only fragment of the core I possessed. I had one desperate, irrational idea. I ran onto the main stage, ignoring the motionless, silent victims. I smashed the soundboard and monitors with the butt of my shotgun, trying to cut the immediate link. The voice continued, unwavering, broadcast through the surrounding walls and speakers. "We want to sing, Marcus. Let us play our song." I stood at the center of the stage, the shotgun clutched in my hand, the skeletal dust trail leading into the wall behind the backdrop. I had to face the source one last time. I held up the melted, charred music box key, the one thing the creature had once needed. "You like music?" I screamed at the silent, frozen audience, at the walls, at the signal. "Then listen to this." I raised the key, placing the jagged, hot metal shard against my own throat. I had to break the signal. I had to provide a sound so raw, so unpredictable, that the creature's rigid anti-frequency couldn't absorb it. A sound that was purely human, purely unplanned. I pushed the melted key into my flesh, biting down hard against the searing pain, and forced myself to scream. Not a shout of fear, but a guttural, biological cry of agony and rage, aimed directly into the silent, waiting microphones of the global frequency. The pain was a white-hot, blinding shock. The melted metal key tore through the soft tissue of my throat, releasing a torrent of blood and a raw, visceral sound that was purely biological. It wasn't a controlled sound. It was the primal, unvarnished noise of human trauma. The effect was instantaneous and explosive, the perfect silence of the global anti-frequency shattered. The crystal-clear child's voice broadcasting through the speakers distorted into a strangled, electronic shriek, a sound of profound distress. The creature's control over the massive signal had been violently interrupted. The static patterns on the black screens pulsed erratically, the white and red lines seeming to twist into grotesque, silent faces. The entire auditorium lighting system and every electronic device in the room began to flicker violently. I kept screaming, pushing the metal deeper, turning the raw noise of my dying vocal cords into a weapon. My vision swam, blood pouring down my uniform, mixing with sweat and tears. I had to create enough static, enough chaos, to overload the system. The creature fought back. The electronic shrieking intensified, a desperate effort to drown out my sound. I felt the familiar, terrible pressure return, localized and aiming specifically at my skull, trying to silence the source. Then, from the walls behind the stage, the chalky dust trail erupted into motion. A small, articulated form, the core sentinel, scrambled out, moving with inhuman speed across the wooden stage floor, directly toward me. It was desperate to silence the chaos. I dropped the key, which clattered on the floor, and swung the barrel of my shotgun wildly, smashing the frail skeletal construct with a thick metal stock. The sentinel didn't break. It exploded. The impact pulverized the small, desiccated bones into a fine, choking cloud of ash and white dust that instantly coated the stage. The creature was not bone. It was a highly organized form of preserved organic material, a conductor for its frequency. When the sentinel disintegrated, the electronic screeching from the speakers stopped. The massive transmitter unit, still coated in the red membrane, let out a violent, shuddering thump and went dark. The broadcast had ended. Silence returned. But this time, it was the fragile, echoing silence of a massive, empty auditorium. The anti-frequency was gone. The people in the auditorium, the volunteers, the anchor, the sound man Tim, began to move. Slowly, their paralysis breaking. They gasped, clutched their ears, and began the collective, panic sound of mass human fear and confusion. I collapsed onto the stage, the pain in my neck immense, my breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. I had overloaded the signal, destroyed its physical host, and broken the creature's immediate connection to the network. I heard the sound of approaching sirens, the real ones this time, the ones the sergeant had finally dispatched. Epilogue. 3 months later, I resigned from the Blackwood PD 2 weeks after the auditorium incident. My throat healed, leaving a long, ragged scar, a permanent, painful reminder of the price of noise. Chief Miller survived, though permanently blinded and institutionalized, incapable of coherent communication. The Ellie husk was cremated, along with the remains of the Henderson House, the investigation concluding with a cover-up involving faulty wiring and mass hysteria, the official narrative. A devastating electrical fire and subsequent toxic gas leak at the auditorium caused temporary paralysis and severe auditory trauma to the victims. No1 spoke of the screaming, the silent paralysis, or the child's voice on the global frequency. They couldn't. The trauma was too bizarre to admit. I moved south, away from the perpetual damp of the Northwest, finding work as a solitary security consultant. I live in a world filled with constant noise, traffic, sirens, phones, television. I crave it. I never use wireless networks, never own a smartphone, and my apartment has no TV. I use a secure, hardwired analog landline. I know the creature is still out there. One evening, I was walking past a local electronics store. Inside, rows of massive, pristine televisions were tuned to a cable news channel. The anchors were discussing a new technological breakthrough, a cutting-edge communication protocol designed to eliminate all digital noise and static from satellite signals. They called it the perfect frequency. I stopped dead on the sidewalk, watching the anchors smile. That night, I received a package. It was an unmarked cardboard box containing a single object, an antique, porcelain doll, dressed in a faded, white nightgown. It was unnervingly similar to the figure I'd seen in the master bedroom. The doll's eyes were two dark, empty pits. Its face was a smooth, porcelain mask, with no trace of a mouth. Attached to the gown, pinned with a rusty safety pin, was a small, folded piece of parchment. It was a note, written in a cramped, dry hand that looked like old chalk dust. The note read, "You taught us how to scream, Marcus. Now we know how to listen perfectly, and we are ready for the debut of the new song. The signal has found its perfect voice." I burned the doll and the note in my fireplace, watching the silence consume them. I knew then that my story was far from over. The whispering station was not destroyed. It had simply gone silent, waiting for the world